So fellas, we've got the last card of the year with Colby Covington returning against Buckley. If you'd have told me a year ago that we were going to see Buckley versus Covington in a fight night main event, I wouldn't have believed you, because this fight, how it's come together and how drastically their careers have changed has been crazy. And we're going to be breaking down every fighter on UFC Tampa as well as my own personal prediction. And we'll just go straight in there with the first fight. Davey Grant versus Ramon Tavares. Davey Grant, 38 years old, which is quite old for the bantamweight division. Well, it's really old for the bantamweight division, but it's not really like his performances are showing that. I came from the Ultimate Fighter way back in 2013. Went 1-3 in his first 4 fights in the UFC, but he managed to pick up one of a Marlon Vera. Then he went on a 3-fight winning streak, including a knockout win over Jonathan Martinez back in 2021, which is impressive. Lost his next 2 fights to Yanez and Marlon Vera, but Yanez was a surging prospect, and as we know, Marlon Vera is a top bantamweight. And even at the time, the fight with Yanez, a lot of people thought he won that fight. Then he went on a 2-fight finishing streak until his most recent fight, where he fought Daniel Marcos at UFC London, and should have beaten Daniel Marcos, but the judges gave it to the wrong guy, which is a shame, because that would have been a great win for Davey Grant. He's going to be taking on Ramon Tavares, who was a bit of a surging guy coming into the UFC with a bunch of finishes. Gets knocked out on the Contender Series. Then he manages to get another opportunity in the UFC, knocks out Cortavius Romeus, and then he rematches City, the same guy that he got knocked out by on the Contender Series, and has a scrap with him and wins a controversial fight in the UFC. I'm going to go with Davey Grant to win this one. Davey Grant has looked really good in the bantamweight division. I'd actually say he's a top 20 bantamweight in the world. But I feel like he keeps getting done dirty by the UFC. If you look at his past couple of fights, I mean, he should have beaten Daniel Marcos. He should be on a 3-fight winning streak now. And even the fight with Adrian Yanez, a lot of people were saying that he won that fight against Adrian Yanez. And that was when Adrian Yanez was a surging prospect in his prime. And you look at Ramon Tavares, his best winner, his only win in the UFC is City, a guy that he's been knocked out by before. And even that was a controversial fight that a lot of people had City winning. So it's not really like he's done anything crazy. His other win was against Cortavius Romeus on the Contender Series, who's already shown that he's not UFC worthy. So I'm going to go Davey Grant. This is a huge step up for Ramon Tavares. He's only just made it to the UFC with a win that, quite frankly, hasn't really shown as if he's UFC worthy, and he's facing a top 20 bantamweight who's tough as nails. Now, I do worry about Davey Grant, because he kind of relies on being in a firefight. He's facing a guy with a ton of power, and he has been out for quite some time now, but I trust that he can get it done. Very well rounded. He's beating some really good guys and has competitive fights even when he loses. So I'm going to say that Davey Grant gets it done by decision. Then we've got Piera Rodriguez versus Josefine Knutsson. Piera Rodriguez was on a bit of a tear outside the UFC, a lot of finishes outside the UFC. Was actually a champion in LFA as well, which is kind of impressive, because LFA is kind of like I say it's impressive, it's basically the promotion that most UFC fighters go to before the UFC. Then she went on a 3-fight winning streak in the UFC, well, from the Contender Series to the UFC. Unfortunately, in her past 2, got submitted by Gillian Robertson, and then got disqualified because she headbutted her opponent like 50 times in the same fight. She's going to be taking on Knutsson, who is a former kickboxer, comes from a kickboxing background, won her first 3 fights in MMA to get a contract in the UFC, and so far, she's looked pretty good in the UFC. Undefeated in the UFC so far. In terms of who I'm picking to win, there's not really much to break down for this fight. I'm not too bothered about this fight. I'm going to go Knutsson to win this one by decision. I think she keeps on the feet. Rodriguez isn't even that good. I think Knutsson keeps on the feet, picks her apart, picks her to the decision. No one really cares about this fight. Next fight, we've got Miles Johns versus Felipe Lima. This should be quite a good fight. You got Miles Johns, who was on a bit of a tear outside the UFC. Actually picked up a win over Adrian Yanez back in 2018, and obviously, as we know now, Adrian Yanez went on to become a massive prospect. Won his first fight on the Contender Series by finish, and so far, he's had a pretty solid career in the UFC. He's lost a couple of fights, but the majority of his career has been pretty uphill. He was supposed to fight Cody Garbrandt twice in a row, but they've both fallen through. It would have been good to see him face Garbrandt, but they both fell through. He's going to be taking on Felipe Lima, who he lost his MMA debut, but since then, he's been in an absolute tear. Was actually the Octagon champion, which is one of the biggest MMA promotions in Europe, so it shows that he's talented because he's a champion in a solid organization. Fights on like a week notice against Mohamed Naimov at UFC Saudi Arabia this year. Outstruck him, took him down, submitted Mohamed Naimov, and looked super impressive, got the underdog win. So I'm going to go with Felipe Lima to win this one by submission in the second round. I think this is a bit of a step down in competition for Felipe Lima. I was expecting him to get maybe a shot at the rankings, maybe against somebody like Dan Ige after he beat Mohamed Naimov. They're giving him Miles Johns. I don't mind this fight, but Miles Johns, he's a pressure wrestler, or at least he were in the beginning of his UFC career, but I'm not sure how well that's going to work against a grappler as good as Felipe Lima. On the feet, he has developed power. He's the more dangerous striker out of the two of them, but I'd say Felipe Lima is the more technical striker, and I also think Felipe Lima is, like I said, the more dangerous on the ground, and he does a better job of mixing up the striking with the grappling. So I'm going to say that Felipe Lima gets it done. I think he's got ranked potential. It's a bit of a step down, and even though Miles Johns could overwhelm Felipe Lima, from what I saw against Mohamed Naimov, who was a dangerous fight, and it was on like a week's notice, I think Felipe Lima gets this one done by submission in the second round. Then we've got another women MMA fight. I think it's the last women MMA fight of the card. Miranda Maverick versus Jamey Horth. Miranda Maverick She had a pretty solid career outside the UFC, quite a long career outside the UFC. Most women MMA fighters, they won a couple of fights and they get signed to the UFC. She had quite a long career. And so far in the UFC, she's had a pretty solid career too. Her only 3 losses are to Jasmine Jasudavicius, Erin Blanchfield, and Macy Barber, 3 of which, all of them are ranked. And even the fight against Macy Barber was quite close and controversial. It's going to be taking on Jamey Lynn Horth, who fought Lupita Godinez twice and beat her twice on the amateurs. Had a pretty solid MMA career, won all of the fights by finish outside the UFC, and so far has gone 2-1 in the UFC. I'm going to pick Miranda Maverick, the biggest favorite on the card to win this one by decision. Yeah, Miranda Maverick, I mean, you look at Jamey Lynn Horth, she's not the best grappler. She hasn't got the best takedown defense. She doesn't deal with grappling the best. And even in fights that she's winning, she gets taken down quite a bit. And you put her against Miranda Maverick, who's shown in the UFC that she's a very solid grappler. That tends to be a game plan. It's a bit of a step down in competition for Miranda Maverick. I think she pulls through this one fairly confidently. Even if Jamey Lynn Horth does somehow keep the fight on the feet and develop amazing takedown defense, it's not even like the striking differential between the two of them is crazy enough that she's going to absolutely dominate Miranda Maverick. So I think Miranda Maverick wins this one pretty comfortably, unanimous decision, and just takes down Jamey Lynn Horth and racks up the control time. Then we've got a fight between 2 unranked featherweights, Sean Woodson versus Francisco Padilla. I think he's named Francisco anyway, I might be making that up, but Padilla versus Sean Woodson. You've got Sean Woodson, who used to be an obese heavyweight boxer, and actually somehow after losing weight has made his build even worse, has one of the most unique builds in the UFC, but came into the UFC by knocking out Terrence McKinney on the Contender Series. And he's had a fairly solid UFC career so far, including a win over Youssef Zalal. Alex Caceres only 1 loss in his UFC career. However, he keeps having these controversial fights. His most recent fight, he fought Alex Caceres, and I think me and most MMA fans thought Alex Caceres won this fight, so it's not like he's dominating these opponents. A lot of split decisions on this winning streak too. He's going to be taking on Padilla, who was also had a massive MMA career outside the UFC. He's basically lived his entire career outside the UFC so far. Has a 9, well, he's mainly a submission artist, with most of his wins coming by way of submission. Lost to Daniga as well on the regional scene too. And so far in the UFC, won on the Contender Series, getting a knockout. Lost it against Kyle Nelson, and he ended up winning his last fight too. So he's 2-1 in the UFC, but I'm going to pick Sean Woodson to win this one by decision. A bit of a step down again for Sean Woodson. I thought he was maybe going to get not a shot at the rankings, but closer to the rankings next, and he's going to be taking on Padilla. So it is a bit of a step down. And Sean Woodson, he's a really good striker. He uses his range very effectively. He beat Charles Jourdain, and even though I thought he lost that fight against Alex Caceres, it wasn't like he did bad in that fight. He used his range very well. He looked very quick on the feet, and Padilla doesn't do that. He's tall as well, but he doesn't use his range effectively. He kind of just pressures people and uses a lot of front kicks. It's almost as if, like, the way that he fights is how you'd expect a shorter guy to fight. Doesn't use his range effectively. Kyle Nelson kind of exposed the game plan of Padilla, so I'm going to go with Sean Woodson to win by decision. I think he confidently just outstrikes Padilla for all 3 rounds. I don't think he gets a finish. I don't think the striking differential between the two of them is that big to the point where he's going to get a finish in this fight, but I just think that Sean Woodson's better. I think he uses his range better, and he impressed me in that fight with Caceres, and obviously beating the likes of Youssef Zalal and Charles Jourdain. So I'm going to go Sean Woodson by decision. Then we've got a really good fight in the lightweight division. Drakkar Klose versus Yoel Alvarez. Drakkar Klose, he was on a bit of a, I keep saying they're on a tear. He wasn't on a tear out in the UFC. He was just undefeated outside the UFC. Comes over to the UFC, wins his first couple of fights in the UFC, loses 1. And they're all by way of decision. Beat Bobby Green as well back in 2018. Then he gets brutally knocked out by Beneil Dariush, but since that knockout loss, he's won his past 4 fights. 2 of them come by way of finish, a slam KO, and also KO Jenkins as well. He's going to be taking on Yoel Alvarez, who in my opinion, I know I said this about Shafkat last week, but I'm changing my mind. Yoel Alvarez might be the most dangerous fighter in the UFC, and I'm also going to go and say he's probably the best unranked lightweight in the UFC. He's got a record of 21-3, and he's never won a single fight by decision. Most of his fights have been by submission, 17 submission wins, 4 by TKO. Comes into the UFC on an absolute tear of just first and second round finishes, most of them coming by way of submission. And even in the UFC, he's got so many submissions latched up in the UFC so far. He lost his UFC debut, but his only other loss outside of that is to Arman Sarukian, who's one of the best lightweights in the world right now, and he just knocked out Elvis Brenner in his most recent fight. I'm going to go with Yoel Alvarez to win this one by submission in the 3rd round. Yeah, Yoel Alvarez, I know I've said this a couple of times in this video, it's a bit of a step down. I was hoping that he was going to fight somebody like Jalin Turner next, or Benoit Saint-Denis, but they've put him against Drakkar Klose. Drakkar Klose isn't the best striker. He's quite powerful, but he is quite stiff on the feet, and it's not like, even though he does have a wrestling heavy game plan, it's not like he's an insane wrestler. He's been taken down by Joe Solecki. I can see Yoel Alvarez, I can see Drakkar Klose kind of initiating the grappling, taking him down, getting him in the clinch, and then from there Yoel Alvarez finds a submission, because Yoel Alvarez isn't really a wrestler. He's kind of one of these guys has really threatening jiu-jitsu, but doesn't really have the wrestling to back it up. But I feel like with Yoel Alvarez, in every single one of his fights, I'm like, how the fuck does he pull off a finish in this fight? And then he somehow surprises me and pulls off a finish. I didn't think he was going to do it against Mark Jaqueze, and he did it. I'm pretty sure I was expecting that fight against him and Elvis Brennan to go to a decision, then randomly he TKOs him. It's almost as if there's some sort of curse where no matter who faces Yoel Alvarez and how good they are, apart from Sarukian, they're always able to get finished by him. But no, Yoel Alvarez, I think he'll find a submission within the distance, or at least get a finish within the distance. Drakkar is good, but I just think Yoel Alvarez is better. I think he's got probably the better striking out of the two of them, way more dangerous than Drakkar, and definitely has better jiu-jitsu. Maybe if he worked on his wrestling, he'd be a little bit more threatening with Yoel Alvarez, but regardless, I think he's the best unranked lightweight. I think he pulls a submission in this fight, but it should be a banger. Then we've got Michael Johnson versus Ottmon Azaitar. Michael Johnson, a veteran of the UFC, came from the Ultimate Fighter way back in 2010, and I'd say he's probably the most inconsistent fighter in UFC history. This guy has a knockout win over Dustin Poirier, beat Tony Ferguson before Ferguson was in his prime. He's had a bunch of good wins, and he's fought at the top of the competition, but he's had a bit of a bad second half to his UFC career. He's fought the likes of Khabib, Gaethje, Diaz, Dariush, and he's lost to those guys. In his past couple of fights, he has been on a massive losing streak. Well, not in his past couple of fights, but towards the end of his career, he's been on a big losing streak, and he's probably got the worst win-to-loss ratio in the UFC. 22-19 is a record, but he did pick up on a win in his most recent fight this year against Darius Flowers. Going to be taking an Ottmon Azaitar, who was also on a bit of a tear outside the UFC, had a lot of good wins. Comes over to the UFC, wins his first two fights by stoppage. Then he kind of got suspended because he tried sneaking potatoes into Fight Island. I'm not sure if that was a cover for steroids, but it got suspended for one of the weirdest reasons, something to do with potatoes, and then ends up losing his next two fights after got finished in his next two fights. Yeah, I'm going to go Michael Johnson to win this one. I think Michael Johnson's going to show up and show the veteran knowledge in this fight. Like I said, he's coming off a good win over Darius Flowers, where even though obviously he didn't look as good as in his prime, he impressed me in that fight. And Ottmon Azaitar's a bit of a crazy fighter. I can see him getting clipped in this fight. I don't really know if I trust him. And his last win was all the way back in 2020 against Karma Worthy. So I'm going to pick Michael Johnson to take home in the third round. Like I said, Azaitar's a bit of a wild striker. I can see him trying to engage in a firefight early on, and Michael Johnson just counters him and clips him, gets the win. So I'm going to go Michael Johnson, the veteran, to get this one. A very beatable fighter is Michael Johnson, a little bit chinny these days. I mean, if you lose to Jamey Malarkey nowadays, that says everything you need to know. But Ottmon Azaitar, I'm still kind of confused if he's UFC worthy. He's been finished in his last two fights. He hasn't won a fight since 2020. I'm going to pick the veteran Michael Johnson to clip him in the first round, because he is quite a powerful dude, he's Michael Johnson too. You put him against a crazy guy like Azaitar, I think he gets the job done. Then we've got Navajo Striling versus Tuccos. Navajo Striling is a kickboxer, or comes from a kickboxing background, actually trains with the likes of Izzy. Won his first couple of fights in MMA, then he comes over to the UFC from the Contender Series, gets a knockout win, and that's all he's done so far. He's going to be taking on Tuccos, who had a bit of an MMA career outside the UFC, had a brutal loss to Zhang Mingyang, who, as we know now, is one of the most dangerous light heavyweights. Lost brutally, got knocked out about 15 times in 1 second. Then he won his next 3 fights in MMA, comes over to the UFC, another chance, loses to Umar Sy, another big light heavyweight prospect. I kind of feel bad for Tuccos, because he keeps getting fed to these prospects and these killers in the light heavyweight division. Every up-and-coming light heavyweight prospect, they just feed him to Tuccos, and that's exactly what we're doing in this fight. And I think it goes the same way. I'm going Striling to win this one by knockout in the first round. Tuccos has a very heavy grappling pressure style, which kind of seems to be working, but it's working at a very low level. He's going to be taking on, like I said, Striling, who's training at a good gym with the likes of Adesanya at City Kickboxing, a gym that's kind of known for good takedown defense, and he's shown that he's a very dangerous striker on the feet. I think he's going to do enough to keep it on the feet due to the gym that he's training at, and I think on the feet between the two of them, it's night and day. I think Striling puts him out there early. Bad fight for Tuccos. Seems like the UFC are kind of just using Tuccos to push Striling, and I think Striling's got a lot of potential in the light heavyweight division. Good kickboxer, trains at a good gym. If he shows good takedown defense in this fight, I think sky's the limit. So I'm going to go Striling to win this one by KO early on. Very good striker. Tuccos hasn't really shown me that he's anywhere near UFC worthy. I'm going Striling to destroy him. Then we've got a fight that I've kind of been going back and forth on ever since it's been announced. Daniel Marcos versus Adrian Yanez. Daniel Marcos, 16-0, undefeated, one of the few undefeated I say one of the few, but I think bantamweight's a division with the most undefeated fighters. Came from the Contender Series, got a good win, finished his next fight, and then he was scheduled to fight Davey Grant. And this is the fight that he robbed. Listen, he didn't do too bad in the fight with Davey Grant, but he did not win that fight. I don't think he should be undefeated. I think most MMA fans thought Davey Grant won that fight, but he did look really good in his most recent fight against Castaneda. Seemed like he'd massively improved. He's going to be taking on Adrian Yanez, who I wouldn't say, he had a bit of an up and down career outside the UFC, to be fair. He was mainly on an upward trajectory, but lost 3 times outside the UFC. And he comes over to the UFC and he kicks off his career with a knockout in the Contender Series. And since then, it's just knockout over knockout over knockout over knockout. Runs into Davey Grant, has a very controversial fight there, just to get a knockout in his next fight against Tony Kelly, until he eventually runs into Rob Font. Rob Font knocks him out in the first round, and then Jonathan Martinez finishes him in the second with leg kicks. But he did pick up a win against Salvador in his most recent fight. Yeah, Adrian Yanez, very dangerous boxer offensively. Yeah, very good boxer. But I just don't know if I trust him in this fight. It seems like I don't want to say he's been exposed, but we saw him in that fight against Davey Grant, who obviously we know is a capable guy. And Davey Grant gave him a tough fight. He got finished by Rob Font and Jonathan Martinez. It essentially looks like every single time Adrian Yanez faces somebody who can smack him back and someone who's got good offense back and is kind of controlled, he loses. Because Adrian Yanez looks really good. He's got amazing offensive boxing, one of the most crisp boxing in the or some of the most crisp boxing in the bantamweight division, but his defense isn't that good, and he's going to be taking on Daniel Marcos, who's got solid defense. So I'm going to be picking Daniel Marcos to win this one by decision, who's got solid defense but also has solid offense as well. Like I said, Adrian Yanez, very crisp boxing, one of the best offensive boxers, and I'd say he's a better offensive boxer, but his defense really lacks. I think if Daniel Marcos can capitalize on the defense, he'll be able to win. And he showed in his most recent fight against Castaneda that it is massively improved since the fight with Davey Grant. I think I trust Daniel Marcos more to get this one done. So I'm going to go Daniel Marcos to win by decision. It's a tough one to call. I was originally going to go with Adrian Yanez, but the more I look into Daniel Marcos in his fight with Castaneda, and the fact that Yanez, let's be honest, hasn't really beaten anyone good. I mean, the dude lost like 3 times previous to the UFC as well. He lost to Miles John, so it seems like every good fighter that Adrian Yanez faces, he loses to. Daniel Marcos, I trust him a little bit more in this fight. Tough fight to call. Wouldn't recommend betting on it, but I'm going to go Daniel Marcos to win this one by decision. I think he just simply outpoints him on the feet, but I do think if anyone's going to have the bigger moments, it will be Yanez. Then we've got Vitor Petrino against Dustin Jacoby. You've got Vitor Petrino, who came into the UFC on a winning streak. Gets a brutal knockout on the Contender Series, wins his next 4 fights, displaying that he's got high-level grappling and high-level striking. Then he gets scheduled to fight Anthony Smith at UFC 301, which everyone thought he was going to win. And then he runs into a guillotine against Anthony Smith and loses to Anthony Smith by finish in 2024. If you're losing to Smith in 2024, it's a bad look. He's going to be taking on Dustin Jacoby, former Glory kickboxing fighter, had a massive career in Glory kickboxing, actually got KO'd and was a victim of Alex Pereira. Comes over to the UFC from the Contender Series, goes on a big winning streak as well in the UFC, was actually a big light heavyweight prospect, but in his last 5 fights, he's lost 4 of them, and has just been finished brutally, well, I keep saying brutally, but he's just been finished by Dominic Reyes, and ended the losing streak of Dominic Reyes. I just don't really know if Jacoby's got it anymore, man. Vitor Petrino, I was saying that he's a massive light heavyweight prospect, and I still think he's a massive light heavyweight prospect. It isn't like he got fraud checked against Anthony Smith. It was just a bit of, I'm not going to throw away the word fluke. It was a fluke, but it also wasn't a fluke, but it was a fluke. But you get what I'm trying to say. Like, he got caught in a guillotine, fair and square loss, but I think if you do him versus Smith 9 times out of 10, he wins most of them. I'm going Vitor Petrino to win this one by TKO in the second. You've got Vitor Petrino, very, very powerful. Looks like he sweats anabolics. Also has a very good grappling base that he's displayed in a couple of fights, specifically against Tyson Pedro. Against Dustin Jacoby, who seems to have a deteriorating chin. And even though he's got solid takedown defense, that's just more for him to worry about. I mean, I think Petrino's got the option to take the fight to the mat. And even if it just does stay standing, I think he's a better striker nowadays, or at least he's got the more power and has a higher finishing ability. So I trust Vitor Petrino. I think he finishes him in the second with TKO. I can see him dropping Jacoby with a big shot, following up with ground and pound and getting the finish, and then hopefully we can see him get another chance at the rankings of the light heavyweight division. So I'm going to go Vitor Petrino by TKO in the second. Then we've got a fight between 2 ranked flyweights. Manel Kape versus Bruno Silva. This is actually going to be quite a good fight. You got Manel Kape, who comes from a Ryzen background, actually finished Kai Asakura in his last fight in Ryzen, who, as we know nowadays, everyone's hyping up Kai Asakura, and he actually finished him in his last fight in Ryzen. Lost his first 2 fights in the UFC, but to be fair, his UFC debut was against Pantoja, just like Asakura's was. But he then after that went on a 4-fight winning streak, including a massive flying knee KO and a knockout over Zagla. Started making a name for himself at the UFC 293 press conference, became a bit of a character in the flyweight division, but ultimately lost his most recent fight in a very boring fight to Mohamed Makayev at UFC 304. He's going to be taking on Bruno Silva, who also lost his first few fights in the UFC to guys that used to be ranked, but he has been on a 4-fight winning streak since then, all of those wins coming by way of finish. I'm going to go Manel Kape to win this one by decision. I know Bruno Silva's been in a bit of a tear in the flyweight division, but I just think Manel Kape, I just don't really see a world where Manel Kape loses this fight. Bruno Silva's he's not the highest level grappler, I know Manel Cap's not going to take the fight to the ground, but his grappling isn't that good anyway. And even on the feet, I guess he's got power, but he's a bit of a sloppy striker. I feel like Manel Cap's a way better striker than Bruno Silva. He's displayed it against better guys. I think he's a better kickboxer, more dangerous on the feet as well. I just think Manel Cap wins anywhere the fight goes. It's going to be predominantly a striking matchup, I expect. And I think Manel Cap will outstrike Bruno Silva. Could even get a finish in this fight. I wouldn't be surprised if Manel Cap gets a finish because Bruno Silva, I know he keeps getting these finishes, but he's got a he's very hittable. He's Bruno Silva. You put him against a powerful striker like Manel Cap, who's got the ability to shut people's lights out. It could be a bad fight for Bruno Silva, but I'm going to go decision. Manel Cap by decision, but this is one of my confident picks. I'm confident that Manel Cap gets it over Bruno Silva, so I'm going to go Manel Cap decision. Then we've got the co-main event, Cub Swanson versus Billy Quarantillo. Yeah, this should be a good fight. A veteran versus a guy. I mean, I don't really know what to call Billy Quarantillo because he's not a prospect. He's not a new guy to the UFC, but he's definitely not a veteran yet. He's kind of just there. But no, you got Cub Swanson, who, yeah, is a veteran to the UFC. He was fighting way back in like WEC. Against the likes of Jose Aldo as well, and he's had a massive career in the UFC so far. However, the second half of his UFC career has been a bit downhill, which we'll talk about. He's going to be taking on Billy Quarantillo, who is a very dangerous fighter outside the UFC, was coming on a winning streak with a couple of finishes. Actually fights on the Ultimate Fighter, loses on the Ultimate Fighter so he doesn't get his UFC contract. Then he picks up a couple of wins again outside the UFC, gets his Contender Series debut, wins on the Contender Series by finish, and then he's had a pretty solid career since then, a bit of an upward trajectory. He finished Alexander Hernandez until eventually ran into Edson Barboza, got brutally knocked out by a knee, and since that fight, he's gone 1-1 in his next two fights, losing to Youssef Salal, but that's not really much of a shame because Youssef Salal in 2024 looks insane. I'm going to go Billy Quarantillo to win this fight by decision. I just don't really trust if Cub Swanson can beat guys like Billy anymore. I feel like for Cub Swanson, as good as he is and as dangerous as he is, I feel like if you're going to give him anyone, you've got to give him other veterans. Like, you look at his past couple of fights since 2020, the two wins against Darren Elkins and Daniel Pineda, he got good finishes in those fights, but they are also kind of veterans as well. Daniel Pineda's a veteran, Darren Elkins is a veteran, so it's not like he's facing these younger guys. And the fight against Dawodu, he lost that fight. I thought Dawodu won that fight pretty comfortably. I don't know how the judges gave that to Cub Swanson, but it was a robbery. And I can just see Billy Q outlanding him. I think Billy Q's a much more dangerous striker, likes to be in a firefight. That could be where Cub Swanson capitalizes on and lands a big shot, but I just think a guy who's as overwhelming as Billy Q is going to be able to get this one done. I can see him winning this one by decision, so I'm going to go Billy Quarantillo to win this one by decision. Cub Swanson probably lasts the entire way. Like I said, veteran, has the experience. He did have a fairly close fight with Andre Philly, but the way that his career is going, it seems like he's on a bit of a way out. Does Cub Swanson got finished by Giga Chikadze, got finished by Jonathan Martinez as well, so I'm going to say that Billy Quarantillo gets it done by decision. And then the main event, Colby Covington versus Joaquin Buckley. Short notice fight, but I'm actually glad. I think this is a much better fight than Buckley versus Gary. You've got Colby Covington, who has basically made his entire career from trash talking. I mean, it literally saved his job. Known for being a big guy at the press conferences, former UFC interim welterweight champion, has fought for the undisputed belt on 3 different occasions, lost all of them. Going to be taking on Buckley, who was a former middleweight journeyman. He used to be a journeyman in the middleweight division. Everyone kind of knew him, but no one really expected him to go far. He was getting finished by guys. He was losing to fights he should have won. And he actually, to be fair though, he actually had one of the best knockouts in UFC history in the middleweight division too. But since moving down to the welterweight division, he's been on a 5-fight winning streak, just recently knocked out Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, so it seems like he's kind of reinvented his career as Buckley since moving to the welterweight division. And I think in terms of who wins this fight, it really depends on which version of Colby Covington shows up. If we see the OG Covington, the Covington that was going against the likes of Woodley, I guess even the Covington that showed up against Jorge Masvidal, or the one that showed up against Ottmon, I think Colby will be able to get this one done. But if we end up seeing the Colby that showed up against Leon Edwards, I just don't really think there's much hope for Colby Covington, and I think the likelihood is the Colby Covington that showed up against Leon Edwards probably is going to show up in this fight. It's the most recent form of Colby Covington. It's on short notice. He hasn't had a full training camp, and I think if he was gun-shy in the fight with Leon, I can only imagine he's going to be gun-shy in this fight too. I'm going to go with Buckley to win this one by TKO in the 4th round. I was going to pick him to win by decision, but in a 5-rounder on short notice for Colby against a very dangerous guy in Buckley who has explosive wrestling. It's not like he's predominantly a striker. He's got explosive wrestling, but he just happens to have insane power on the feet. Enough power to knock out Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. So I'm going to go Buckley to win this one. I can see maybe Colby having success later on. As long as the fight goes, that's where Covington's going to have the most success because he's known for having this insane stamina. I can't see Buckley doing well in the last couple of rounds, but I could see Buckley just clipping Colby Covington. I think he keeps the fight stood. And like I said, Colby Covington was gun-shy against Leon Edwards. I can only imagine he's going to be gun-shy against Buckley, who, in my opinion, is more dangerous than Leon. I'm not saying he's a better fighter than Leon. I'm not saying he'd beat Leon. I just think he's more dangerous because of the power that he carries and the fact that he's got a very explosive style. So I think Buckley gets it done by finish, probably around round 3, round 4 by TKO. Clips Colby with a big shot, finishes him with ground and pound, or just... I don't know. I just see Buckley getting a TKO in this fight. But that is how I will predict UFC Tampa. I think Buckley gets it done. Let me know your predictions for this card. If you agree, disagree. Thank you for watching.